Of Million Bazillion is streamable now, and what you just heard was produced by our Erica Soderstrom. I'm David Brancaccio. This is the Marketplace Morning Report. From APM, American Public Media.
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan Law Firm.
I'm Wayne Hogan. It's the #1 killer of teens. One text or call can wreck it all. Let's put an end to distracted driving.
Learn more at waynehogan.law.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect with Melissa Ross. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com.
North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Opinions expressed on the Friday Media Roundtable are those of our panelists and do not necessarily reflect the views of WJCT News.
It's the biggest stories from this week. I'm Raymond Troncoso, sitting in for Melissa Ross. And just ahead this hour, we'll take a look back at the week's top stories with our First Coast Connect Friday Media Roundtable. All that and more just ahead with our roundtable.
This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Claire Huddles. Early voting ends this weekend ahead of Tuesday's primary elections. So what will you do if you still need to cast your ballot? Steve Newborn fills us in.
The primary elections end Tuesday, with people having the option of voting in person at assigned precincts between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. And you can also return your vote-by-mail ballot as late as 7 on Tuesday night. But know that state lawmakers have reduced the number of places where you can drop them off, as well as the number of ballots you can deliver. You can physically take vote-by-mail ballots to drop-off boxes outside early voting sites in your county, but only when the location is open so a staffer is on site. You can also drop off a ballot in person at your county supervisor of elections offices. And don't plan to deliver more than 4 mail-in ballots. Doing so now is a third-degree felony, and 2 of those ballots must be your own and that of an immediate family member. I'm Steve Newborn in Tampa.
Registered Republicans and Democrats will vote for party candidates in many races, but every voter is eligible to pick favorites in nonpartisan races, such as school boards and referendums. A federal judge yesterday sided with a Florida business that challenged the state's Stop Woke Act. The judge issued a preliminary injunction ruling the part of the law that restricts race-based conversation and analysis in business and education is unconstitutional. The case is one of 3 challenging the controversial law that targets what Governor Ron DeSantis has called, quote, pernicious ideology, exemplified by critical race theory, the idea that racism is systemic in U.S. institutions. The other 2 lawsuits were filed by educators and students. It's currently 75 degrees in Jacksonville. We're expecting mostly sunny skies this morning and scattered showers this afternoon. This is WJCT News.
The Florida Education Commissioner gives his staff the go-ahead to pull LGBTQ support documents in all Florida school districts. New questions about Jacksonville Sheriff candidate TK Waters' residency and voter registration, and candidates make their final campaign pushes in advance of Election Day next Tuesday. There's also a referendum that could increase property taxes. Those are some of the biggest stories making headlines this week. Good morning. This is First Coast Connect. I'm Raymond Troncoso, sitting in for Melissa Ross. Thanks for listening. And just ahead, all the biggest stories of this week with our Friday Media Roundtable. 549-2937 is the number to call. Then later, a milestone for Babs Labs. But first, it's Friday, and here to discuss a busy news week, we welcome Will Brown, reporter with WJCT News. Welcome, Will.
Good morning.
We also have Claire Goforth with the Daily Dot.
Good morning.
We have Jack Webb, local attorney and former city council president.
Live in studio.
And we also have Andrew Pantazzi of the Tributary.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, so our first big story today, and remember, if you're at home, you can give us a call at 549-2937. You can email us at firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, comment on our Facebook page, or tweet us at WJCT News. So first things first, the Florida Department of Education is pulling LGBTQ resource guides. We've done some reporting on this. Claire Heddles at WJCT News. Claire, go forth. Mm-hmm. This seems to be kind of a pattern. First, it was with the Florida Parental Rights and Education Bill, which is kind of the impetus for this being done. Tell us a little bit about what's been going on statewide in terms of LGBTQ resource guides.
So what we're seeing statewide is various districts are scaling back or completely pulling resource guides that are meant to protect LGBTQ students. That's based on what is dubbed the Parental Rights and Education Act, but critics call the Don't Say Gay Act, which broadly prohibits discussions of gender and sexual orientation in the K through 3, but then also for students up to grades 12 that's age appropriate. School districts have reacted to that by, scaling back these rules. We saw in Duval County, they were scraping safe space stickers off of classrooms and basically putting students in a position where it's really unclear whether or not they can discuss these issues with their educators, whether or not their parents will be informed of their preferred names and pronouns and things of that nature. A lot of critics say that this is putting students in a more precarious situation, which is particularly dangerous for LGBTQ students who are at increased risk of suicide ideation and attempts, depression, and various other serious mental health issues.
So, Andrew, as Claire said, school boards were already kind of taking a look at these resource guides, trying to pare them down to comply with the law. It turns out that this was the reason these guides were pulled was because board members at the Department of Education looked at a Palm Beach school district. Specifically, in their guide, they said, students, their sexual orientation or gender identity shouldn't be disclosed to their parents without their consent. It turns out that school district had already removed that from their guide when it was being read at this department. It turns out even if schools have already reviewed, it looks like it wasn't enough.
Yeah, and in this case, we don't even know if it was enough or not because the Florida Department of Education, the board, was looking at it and they were looking at something that had already changed. And apparently they were unaware of the fact that it had changed. And they were citing it as an example of school districts not complying with the new law. Even though obviously in this case, they're reading a sentence that's already been removed by the school district. I think this is just the latest sign in how the state is not deferring to local governments when it comes to any policy making. And there is an assumption that the state abides, that the state must swoop in and that they're going to question anything that a local governing board that's been elected. So you've got this unelected board at the state level that's going to come in and tell elected school boards that they don't know what's best for the community that they're in. And even when they're trying to comply with state laws, they're not going to, in good faith, look at the latest policies, but instead look at outdated policies. This is something that we've seen as a trend in all level of government, where Tallahassee really thinks it's best that they expand as much as possible and that they override any decisions that can be made at the local level. This has really just been this consistent over decades kind of abrogation of home rule that we've seen that really takes away power from the local governing bodies and just shifts it over to these boards that are appointed by the governor and others in Tallahassee.
So, Jack, when you were on the school board or when you were on city council, you probably had a pretty close relationship to school board. Mm-hmm. You're both local outlets. In your time, did you see this kind of maybe overreach from the state government at the local level?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did. And as I was saying before, it's been a kind of a slippery slope of encroachment of state authority over the local government. And I was very critical of it at the time. At that point, Mayor Payton, it was John Payton who was the mayor, and we had fiscal issues. We had taxation issues. The economy in 2008, 2009 had tanked, so revenues were off. We had to do something with the millage rate. But at that very time, the state legislature decided, hey, listen, we're going to cap rate increases or whatever. So that's why we have the fees that we have today. But my criticism of the legislature at the time was this: hey, all you conservative Republicans, you're all conservative when you're on a local level. Then you get elected to the state level. You want to tell local government how to do their business. And this is just more of the same. Andrew makes a good point with regards to not deferring to the local boards. That said, this is another example of a fall down at Tallahassee. If you're going to say that we're going to have uniform guidelines, then there is an administrative process to come up with, to vet the guidelines. If you're going to take responsibility for it, you need to own it. And obviously that didn't happen. And now we've got chaos. One last point on this. All of this confusion seems to be driven by the vagueness itself of the statute. And I'm quite shocked that there's not been a constitutional challenge to the statute based on vagueness.
Will, you've kind of already covered what's going on with school board. Of course, the school year has already started. Kids are already in school. You talked with the superintendent. Can you tell us a little bit about what the feeling is around? I mean, they're dealing with so much. What's the feeling around, these kinds of decisions at the school level when they're already trying to deal with getting kids to class, coming back from COVID, a new world, basically?
Like you said, it's a new world, and there's always something else. That is the sense I get every time I speak with I have a chance to speak with Dr. Green or just listen to what she has to say. There's something else, whether it's the uproar over school name changes, whether it's dealing with the pandemic, whether it's dealing with people who are choosing or not choosing to wear masks in schools, whether it's child safety after another school shooting late last school year. So this is just something else. And in my opinion, it would help school districts who are doing what they can with the resources they can to have clarity. And that's not something that they're getting as readily as they possibly could.
Claire, Duval schools, they already went through, a pretty extensive legal review they spent a lot of time, a lot of effort, probably a lot of money looking through this resource guide to try to be in compliance with the law, to kind of have the rug pulled under them. What kind of message does that send to the school board, and what message does that send to LGBTQ students who probably relied on this resource before?
To the educators, it sends a message that it really doesn't matter what you do. You're probably still going to be up in confusion. It could be changed at the last second, and you're going to be scrambling to try to comply, because we know school officials do their best to try to avoid, for one, getting sued, for two, just violating the law. It just creates so much confusion. And then for the students themselves, now they're going to school in an environment where they wonder if they have a conversation with an educator who they trust about something that's going on in their lives. Well, that person may then be sued, quite frankly. And also, are they safe to be who they are authentically in school? Children, teens, they are at a part time of their life where they're figuring things out. And, just making it so that they feel less comfortable, it takes away from the ultimate goal, which is to educate students. I mean, the point of going to school is to learn, but at the same time, you're also learning emotional things, and you're learning how you fit in the world. And if all of that is in disarray and you're feeling less protected in your classroom, it's going to distract you from actually the academic portion of school, I would argue.
Yeah, and it's about students feeling safe. And like you brought up before, they've kind of scraped stickers that said, hey, this is a safe space for you. And they've removed those now from Duval schools and other schools in the state. If you want to join in on the conversation, the number is 549-2937. We're going to go to Jim in Orange Park. Hey, Jim, you're on the air.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for taking my call. So 2 points here. I'm a independent school teacher, and fortunately for us, some of those rules don't apply. So we still have our safe space stickers in our classrooms, and our kids know about that. That's 1 point. My second is that it's ironic that the governor will talk about the federal government and its overreach capacities when it's dealing with the CDC and other things that affect the state, but at home he's quick to have executive reach into the local school boards or decision-making processes that the local communities do. So I just find that ironic. Thanks for taking my call.
Thanks, Jim. Going to you, Jack, that's something that you kind of touched on earlier, is that, it's small government for me when it comes at the, we want state control, not federal control, but you can't have local control.
Absolutely. Jim, you just nailed it. I mean, that's exactly what I was complaining about, and that's been the slippery slope that we've been experiencing. And, Governor DeSantis, going to run for president. What's that going to look like?
Andrew, Jim also touched on, the times that he hasn't taken advice from the CDC. So we have our Surgeon General, Latipo, who kind of goes against any sort of CDC guidance, saying, hey, we're not going to follow that. We're going to be kind of unique in the state of Florida. Let's talk about that a little bit. The times that we've kind of resisted executive overreach from the federal level, but then we don't apply that here at home.
Yeah, I think that there is tied in with all of this also in a degree of arrogance of there's one right way to do things as well. I think especially when we look at schools where school policies are really messy because we're dealing with such different backgrounds people are coming from, such different needs that students have, that it's, whether no matter what policy you're thinking of, there is not one size fits all that works for all students or all districts or all communities. And when you have this belief that, we need to impose at a state level, that's really limiting the ability to respond to localized specific issues in your community. And I think we will criticize when we feel like the federal government is giving too broad of rulings for the states. The governor will, the legislature will, but then they'll turn around and do the same thing at the state level against local governments. There's such a fear that local communities may go beyond what the state thinks is acceptable. And this idea of laboratories of democracy, that states are supposed to be experimenting and local governments are supposed to be experimenting with different policies to try to figure out what actually works. That doesn't seem to be playing out. We're not allowing for experimentation to figure out what is the best policy for a Duval County versus a Bradford County versus, a Baker County, a Nassau County, a St. John's, a Clay. Instead, we're taking a one-size-fits-all approach. And it makes it, I'm sure, very hard for people, whether you're in elected office or whether you are a teacher or whether you're a school administrator or whether you're a parent or a voter, because how are you supposed to judge this when there's such limitations being imposed by the state on how far you're able to go and such a uniform ruling that's coming down. And again, it's coming down from there's nothing wrong with appointed boards, but it's coming down from a non-elected board, which means there's not an accountability to parents or to voters. There's not an accountability to say, hey, we disagree with how much you're imposing on us because this is coming from the State Department of Education as opposed to from local school boards, where if the local school board goes too far beyond what voters in that community think is acceptable, they're held accountable, that they go before the voters and the voters can vote out that school board. The voters can't vote out, the State Department of Education, the commissioner or the board.
But they can vote out the person who appointed them.
They can, yes. And so this is where I will be really curious. A lot of Republicans have looked to Virginia as an example of a recent election where school issues seem to play a major factor in supporting a Republican candidate who won for governor. And I think that has been an assumption here, but we still don't know how people are actually going to respond to this, because that was an assumption based off, Democrats and liberals are imposing liberal policies statewide on schools.
For COVID.
Yeah, for COVID.
Specifically,
but also for curriculum and things like that. But now we're seeing the reverse happen here, where curriculum is being blocked.
Textbooks were pulled.
Yeah, a lot of textbooks were pulled. A lot of budget decisions had to be changed to accommodate more of a conservative leaning curriculum. And we're seeing a lot of policies in that way. And so whether parents are okay with that, since parents seem to be a riling message when it was coming from a more liberal or left-leaning perspective. We don't know that means necessarily parents want the conservative version of that, where it's now we have conservative curriculum that we're teaching and things like that. Education may be a major factor for parents. And I think especially when we think about the LGBTQ issue in Jacksonville, this is an issue that has very rapidly and radically changed in our own community. We can think about the HRO vote under Mayor Alvin Brown that failed, and then when it passed a second time after it needed to be revised under Lenny Curry, where this is something that is no longer a very partisan issue.
Yeah, it's not a partisan issue. It's something that people across the aisle now care about, as people feel more free to have these kinds of identities, when previously, before, especially in Florida, not that long ago, it was very much not accepted. And on that note, I'd like to kind of read a comment from one of our listeners, Paula Steiner, who quotes Timothy Snyder, the writer of On Tyranny, who said that if overreaching laws are being proposed, the last thing you want to do is leap to comply before the law is even in place. Authoritarians don't need encouragement. On that note, we're going to reset and kind of go to our next topic. Another really big deal here in Jacksonville is TK Waters' residency issues. Andrew Pantazzi, you wrote an article that kind of revealed that TK Waters, who's currently one of the two leading candidates for sheriff, had registered to vote, and his wife actually did vote at a registered address that they no longer live in Nocatee, while they're both currently renting a place on the north side. So those are two different precincts, and that might actually be a felony. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I have been reaching out to the sheriff's candidates, hoping to write about, policy distinctions between the candidates. And just like this show, WJCT invited Chief Waters onto the show, and he declined and did not come on. Similarly, the campaign was not making him available for interviews. And it's common for reporters to want to go to someone's house if they're not making themselves available for interviews, to give them a chance to respond. It turns out his house, where at least his wife is registered and where he's believed to be registered to vote, nobody was living there. And in fact, they had an open house over the weekend, and the entire house is empty with no food, no clothes, no toothbrush. It's very clear nobody lives there, yet this is the house where they're voting from, where their ballot dictates what they're able to vote in, and it's Nocatee elections, the Duval side of Nocatee, to be clear. But this means when you're talking about state house, state senate, school board, the city council specials, all of these races, Congress, they're getting a ballot that they're voting on, which is not where they live. The campaign says he actually lives on the north side. They're not sharing where he lives. A number of journalists have reached out to say, would you show us where he lives? We won't make this public. Just prove to us he lives.
And they haven't responded, yeah. Or they'll say that, we don't want to share that information.
Yeah, they'll say they want to keep that private. In a normal time, residency issues pop up, and it's not a huge salient issue for voters. I think this is a little bit different, because the entire reason we're having this election is because former Sheriff Mike Williams illegally moved out of the county and went to Nassau County, which triggered this special election. Now, we have no evidence that Chief Waters doesn't live in Duval. He says he does live in Duval County and that he's lived here since the 1990s. But we also just don't know where he does live. And it's problematic that since 2018, he moved in 2018. He changed his registration in 2018. And it's believed he changed it to a fellow JSO sergeant's house. We don't know if he actually ever lived in that house. And since then, he says he's moved a number of times, yet he's continued to vote from this JSO sergeant's house in Nocatee ever since 2018. And this is the guy who, up until recently, was the chief of investigations. He was the head over all investigations. He's also faced throughout this campaign questions about his residency. He says this was inadvertent. But it's hard to believe that someone who's been asked repeatedly about residency, and someone who is in charge of investigations, which can include investigations into alleged voter fraud, was not thinking about, hey, my ballot each time I vote says all these Nocatee elections instead of elections on the north side,
on the north side where
I
he lives. So on jackstoday.com, we've had Claire Heddles cover this. She does have a timeline, if you go to jackstoday.com, of his living situations. His son had tragically passed away in 2018. He said that's the reason he initially moved from his original Nocatee home to this other Nocatee home, which was owned by a fellow sergeant. We know for around a year last year, he was living at a park, which is part of a PD program Jacksonville Sheriff's Office program where cops can live in parks for free. They don't pay rent. They don't pay utilities. He lived there for about a year. He says he's having a new house built in the north side, and until then, he's renting. On this residency requirement, we have Linda and Mandarin. Linda, can you hear me? Welcome to the show.
Because with election integrity and the governor just having, counting 20 people arrested with his new police force, isn't the whole meltdown from 2020 about voter integrity? Not only voting, but where you're registered to vote. Where have you voted? And I know you guys have been pressing Officer Waters for months. And really, that's that's just conjecture. But, if you don't want to have something muddy to talk about that you don't want to answer, you don't make yourself available for interviews. And for me, if you're asking for my vote, you need to interview for the job like anybody else. This residency issue was salient from the beginning. And every time he got up on a panel for a panel discussion, just me, I'm just my own, Perry Mason reporter, I would have just said, we're not going to go to the next question, Mr. Waters, until you answer this question, because this is why we're having this election for sheriff. So I want to ask the governor, that's what you guys should do for the governor. Call the governor's office and say, you're touting 20 new people that just got arrested. Are you sending your election integrity police force to come after TK Waters? We need to be equal.
Oh, it looks like we lost you there, Linda. This isn't a new issue. This is something that's come up in the past. Jack, actually, when you were on the city council, something similar in terms of residency requirements happened to a colleague of yours.
That's correct. It was 2007, and I was running for District 6 in Mandarin, got elected. Jay Jabor was running at large, and I think the residence requirement for that particular at-large seat included the beaches. And I believe Jay owned a condominium out there, but Jay was a well-known San Marco business person and very well-respected in the community, great human being. Tragically passed away soon thereafter, but he stepped away. He was elected, and there was a challenge brought, and ultimately he, rather than spend a lot of money fighting a war that he probably wasn't going to win, and again distracting from the business of the city, business of the council, Councilman Jabor stepped away. With regards to this issue, though, I really don't get it. I just don't understand it. If you're gonna run for sheriff, cross your T's, dot your I's, make certain you when you swear that oath, you know what you're doing. These oaths, the law is the law, and notwithstanding the credibility issues. I mean, as you point out, it's just mind-boggling to me that we now have a situation where if Chief Waters is elected, will this subject his election to challenge in the courts, or will his candidacy, will there be a lawsuit brought to strike his name from the ballot in the upcoming election? It's very possible, and it's a shame because here we are again.
I do want to say something like that Jack was saying about the dotting I's and crossing T's. To me, the response is very interesting. When Sheriff Williams, when it was found that he lived in Nassau County, now Sheriff Ivey, who was then the undersheriff, one of his defenses of it was that this was an obscure law. Undersheriff Ivey, when he was undersheriff, in response to the Times Union's reporting on pedestrian citations that were predominantly used against black residents in Jacksonville.
It's not an excuse.
He attacked and said, there's no excuse for this. If we have a law, we're going to use that law to stop you and search you for, guns and knives and drugs, and we're going to use every law we have at our disposal. But when it's against the sheriff, it's, this is an obscure law and it seems unfair. And then similarly this time, it was inadvertent. Is the claim from the
statement from TK Waters. He said that it was inadvertent that he had remained registered at this old address, but that he had received permission to do so. Which we've asked the supervisor of elections. They haven't gotten back to us. Claire, what do you think about that kind of statement where it says, it's not allowed, but I was given permission?
Permission to flout the law? I mean, I'd like permission to flout the law. So, hey, if any law enforcement agency wants to just give me carte blanche to do whatever I want, that sounds great. The thing with this is like we've been saying, look, former Sheriff Mike Williams resigned based on residency in June. So clearly TK Waters was under notice that this is an issue. Arguably, maybe he hasn't voted since 2018, in which case you wouldn't realize that you were voting for the wrong district, but it just feels disingenuous. And no, simultaneously, as the caller referenced, we have the governor announcing the rest of 20 people for alleged voter fraud. Those people, according to the governor's new election integrity police force, voted after being convicted of certain classes of felonies that preclude you from voting forever. So if the governor is going to be fair-minded and equal in the prosecution of this law with this election integrity police force, should he not investigate TK Waters for potential voter fraud? I think it's extremely unlikely, because didn't he endorse TK Waters? But it just gives this impression that there's one set of rules for powerful people, and then there's another set of rules for the rest of us. And that is really not how our democracy is supposed to function.
But that's the second time we've had this discussion on this show today about there's one set of rules for some people, and there's a set of rules for rules and laws for other people. I just want to point out the absurdity of something. If I got pulled over for speeding and I told JSO, hey, I inadvertently was going 17 over the speed limit, that's not going to go over well for me. I got special permission from a deputy or someone. I got special permission to go speeding. That's not going to go over well for me. And like you said, Jack, if you're going to run for public office, whether it's sheriff, whether it's governor, whether it's like something on like the Soil and Water Commission, make sure all of your things are dotted and crossed. Yeah. Because otherwise, how can the public, whatever party you're in, trust what you're saying? Like, if you can't get your house in order, how are you going to get the public's house in order?
And on that note, there were arrests that were just announced. 17 people were arrested for violating the law by having violent felonies on their record and casting a ballot, and they've been arrested. We've also had people arrested in the villages for casting ballots, both in Florida and in other states, in some instances voting twice or trying to vote both their ballot and a family member's ballot. And these are things that have been prosecuted in the state of Florida. But it seems like when you're powerful, like you're saying, I've had permission to do it.
And again, it would be different if the standard were consistent, because like what we've seen in Gainesville, there's been these investigations into people who registered to vote after Amendment 4 thinking they had their rights restored, but they didn't. And it's like, that was inadvertent. And if the standard were, look, we're looking for people who are intentionally trying to subvert the election system, who know that they can't vote and they're intentionally voting, like, that's one thing if that's the standard across the board, but that's not the standard for certain people. But as Will said, when you are elite, when you belong to a certain class where you are in the in group, all of a sudden, no, like, oh, that was inadvertent. I know that guy. He's a good guy. He didn't mean it. It was like complete accident, which it may be. We don't know that it was not intentional or that it was not unintentional. But regardless, when it's unintentional and I do it, there's a different standard than when it's unintentional and the former chief of investigations does it.
Ray, excuse me. Yeah, Ray, when I recall reading the comments or listening to the comments when Sheriff Ivey was appointed by the governor, okay? And despite the fact that the general counsel had written a letter saying an opinion statement.
That was withdrawn eventually.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But at that point, he said, listen, he's outside, He's outside the county. There's a vacancy. We got a problem here, okay? That's the long and short of it. And Sheriff Ivey said, well, we disagree with the city. Well, wait a minute, Sheriff. Last time I looked, the city was responsible for your budget. You are the city. We are the city. You don't disagree with the city, and that pointed out to me a lot. Is there a larger cultural issue with respect to the leadership at JSO? I mean, what's going on? You have an absentee sheriff who was removed himself, and they flout the rules when it comes to them. I'm not saying this is for the rank and file, but is there a cultural problem with the leadership at the JSO? I'll throw it out there.
To say for Jacksonville in general, we actually just received a statement from Mike Hogan, who is the supervisor of elections, And when we asked him, does an outdated voting record at the wrong address impact Waters' candidacy in any way, his simple reply was, no, it does not. And when asked, if he could fact check the statement that, I had permission, this was inadvertent, Hogan basically said, hey, that's out of our hands. Our office has no investigatory or prosecutionary power. We accept whatever information is provided by the applicant in the corners of the document provided to us by the voter. So it seems like, again, that's kind of passing the buck down the road. Like, hey, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. That's not my problem.
Well, Raymond, if I could, I will say there's a distinction here, which is as long as TK Waters lived in Duval County, he's qualified to be on the ballot, even if he committed a felony by voting illegally. Like you can break the law by voting illegally at the wrong place, but as long as you're still in the county, you're qualified. The issue with Jay Jabor was he had 2 homes and he didn't actually live.
And his residency was not for the office that he saw. While TK, he's been registered at the Stonkatee address, which is within Jacksonville city limits. So he should be qualified on that respect.
Yeah, so as long as he's lived, I mean, if someone has proof that he has not lived there, that would be different. And I don't have any proof that he lives outside the county. But that's separate from the criminal issue. I will say part of the expansion of by the governor of this election crime task force also gave supervisors of elections more investigative power than they used to have. So I would question Supervisor Hogan's statement on that, just because part of that was allowing supervisors to do more proactive investigations into.
That's an interesting point, because traditionally supervisor of elections, it's a purely ministerial function. Yeah. It's up to the candidate to swear the oath, and all they do is process the paperwork. So that's an interesting point.
But if somebody like hypothetically diverted some money from JSO's budget to have investigative powers for the supervisor of elections office, people will be crying enough to fill the St. John's River.
Yeah.
So I mean, let's be careful what we wish for here.
Yeah.
If we want to have supervisor of elections offices that have more investigatory power, great. But it's not like we have a whole bunch of money that we can just go print on trees to go make this happen. So for the same folks who are arguing this is a great idea to have more investigatory power, that money's probably going to come from somewhere else in the budget. Now, is it probably going to come from JSO or law enforcement budget? Probably not. But I always like to say be careful what you wish for, because governments, no matter how much they profess otherwise, they just can't print money from trees.
Well, I'll say to Jack's point about the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and the culture there. I mean, I do think this is goes back to consolidation, as so many things in our community does. When we consolidated and we got rid of a police department and we no longer had an appointed police chief who was answerable to city council and to a mayor, instead we got an elected sheriff who had much more constitutional authority to run his own ship. Since consolidation, I think that has created within the department probably less of a feeling that you have to answer, even though consolidation still says OGC is their lawyer and they need to answer to OGC.
They represent the city. And speaking of, the sheriff is an elected position. We have elections coming up. We're currently in the middle of an election, early voting. Next Tuesday, we'll decide who's sheriff for at least another year. And on that topic, we had some polls this week from UNF. We had both statewide and local polls. Those polls were pretty interesting. Claire, the poll showed that, TK is basically in a statistical tie with Lakeisha Burton, who is a Democrat, one of many Democrats in the field. TK is the only Republican. He's also endorsed by DeSantis. Do you think this is going to impact that polling at all that shows that they're basically in a statistical tie?
It very well could. I mean, and just full disclosure, Lakeisha Burton was in my 2019 Leadership Jacksonville class, the best class. But, these type of elections are won by very, very thin margins. And you're going to get your really hardcore voter. Unfortunately, we don't see very high turnout for primary elections in August. So, I mean, even a tiny shift could make the difference in this. But from the polling, it does look like no matter what, they're headed to a November runoff. So in which case, then if whoever triumphs, again, whoever's at the top two, provided that those two individuals include TK Waters, that person is probably going to make this a huge issue coming into the fall as they try to campaign for sheriff.
Linda, we're going to go to the phones right now. This is Linda.
I'm sorry, guys. You guys are doing a great job. I'm glad for this discussion. But I really want us to hold the top law. That would be like saying Merrick Garland, we're going to make, he just needs to tell us. No, TK Waters is his obligation. He has applied for a job. Can I go to a job and tell them, well, they asked you for the last 5 years of residency. Can I tell them, well, no, I can't really tell you. I know somebody knows where he lives, but is his job as an applicant for the top law enforcement in Duval County to tell us with clarity that he has lived in here consecutively, that he has never voted outside his precinct, and it's his job to give that to us. We're assuming you say, well, as long as he lives in the county, but nobody has really legally confirmed that. They say he lives on the north side. Has anybody given in a sleeve his electric bill with his name on it? Mm-hmm. I'm just asking, let's not give our elected officials a pass. They're not human right now. They are superhuman because they're putting pressure on us as normal citizens. So when you apply for top law enforcement, I want you to be squeaky clean. And if you have made errors, which we all have, come clean and just say, I'm human, I made a mistake, but explain it. Don't not I
fully agree, Linda, and that's something that we've touched on earlier is that, there's one set of rules for, I guess, everyone else and another for people who have connections with those in power. On this race, where also there's a school board referendum that's going to be on this ballot. Pretty split it's pretty much along party lines. Republicans mostly opposed to it, Democrats mostly in favor of it. That's going to kind of raise property taxes for the school board millage rates. This is something that's supposed to fund basically bonuses for teachers who've been hit hard. There's a lot of vacancies in the Duval County school system right now. Jack, this is something that, I've heard people on city council say, once you raise taxes, they're never going to come down. That's something that Republicans say, while Democrats say that, hey, we need this funding. It's a hard world. Inflation's hit everyone, teachers especially, and we need teachers in these schools. Let's talk about that balance.
Yeah, interesting. I think that the referendum is tied back to the sheriff's race to a certain extent. I think there's going to be some flow in that, and that if the whole issue with TK Waters affects Democratic turnout and swings NPAs, and those people are more prone to show up because of what's going on in the sheriff's race, I think that bodes well for the school board referendum as well. Now, with regards to raising taxes, I mean, as we all know, we've been battling a low millage rate here in the city of Jacksonville, both on the school board side and the the services district for many, many years. So the money's needed. I will say this, not to pile on Governor DeSantis, but he just did announce a $22 billion budget surplus, so there might be some money there for teachers as well.
That can be spread around. On that note, we're going to go to, actually, we have a candidate for school board who used to be school board president, is currently on the school board, Elizabeth Anderson. Elizabeth, you're on the air.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. I just want to say thank you guys so much for having these conversations. I think they're critically important. As you mentioned, I have been serving on the school board for the last 4 years, and I'm currently running for re-election. And this one-size-fits-all Tallahassee politics that you're talking about here, where people are hand-chosen to push a political agenda and takes, decision-making out of the hands of our local community is troubling to me as someone who's been on the board for 4 years, but as a candidate as well. I think at least for the school board, these are nonpartisan seats, and they're nonpartisan for a reason, because I think that people want folks to sit on a school board that focus on our children and our schools and doing what's, good to make sure that they get the education that they need. So I just want to encourage people to get out and vote. School board races for District 2, my district, and District 4 will be decided during the primary, and they're nonpartisan. So anybody can vote, no matter your party affiliation, and they'll be done. So it's just really important for people to get out and vote if you want to have local control and a voice in what happens here on our school board.
Thanks for that, Elizabeth. These are supposed to be nonpartisan races for school board, but we've seen that this cycle especially, they've become extremely partisan, with DeSantis himself coming out and endorsing candidates, which is something that's pretty unusual. Andrew, can you think of a time when other governors have come out and specifically endorsed candidates because they kind of represent their ideological bend, party bend?
Maybe not past times with the governor endorsing, but I can say it's not new for like the local GOP to send out mailers saying, hey, so-and-so is the only registered Republican in this school board district race. And to send those out because while the candidates may run nonpartisan, the parties will sometimes intervene and try to make it partisan. But I think part of the push right now is because it's not been super successful. Usually the more partisan candidates have not won, and instead, at least in Duval County, but in also other counties across the state, we see people really like electing educators. People really like electing former teachers, principals, people from the district, even over someone who has a lot more money in their campaign account or someone else who is more closely aligned with political allies. That's been one of the few places in elected office where I think there has not been as much success by the normal good old boys network power players in our community and in other communities. And I think that's one of the reasons why some people want to make it partisan as well. Even beyond the partisan policy intent is it makes it so that there is more of an appointing process of certain people being able to say, this is the person who's going to get the Republican nod, or this is the person who's going to get the Democratic nod. And therefore, it makes it less likely that someone who maybe wants to join the school board just because they care about school policy and don't really care that much about other political issues has less of a chance.
The only time I'd ever seen that was a number of years ago when Jeb Bush was governor. I believe he endorsed Jason Fisher. That was some time ago, but that was the only time I'd ever seen it, and I've never seen it since.
Yeah, obviously back then.
I do want to note that we're talking about the school board races, and previously, really tied to that issue is the referendum that we just discussed. That's also going to be decided on this primary ballot. That's going to be the only time that it's going to be brought up. So that election is Tuesday. We're currently in early voting. I will note that currently has 51% barely majority support according to UNF polling. But again, that's razor thin margin, and it's along partisan lines. One thing I will note that is kind of had support from both sides on that poll, both overwhelmingly Republican and Democrat, which, Will, you can probably speak to, is opposition to paying for a new Jaguar stadium.
That's the only thing that is universally accepted, which, I mean, let's be very bluntly honest about this. This is going to cost, at a minimum, $150 million at the absolute bare bones minimum end
in tax dollars.
In your public dollars.
Yeah, at a minimum 150 million. Tampa Bay renovated their stadium and concourses and other things. They spent 160 million. Miami, I think they used all private funding. I think they spent more than 300 million. Jacksonville has a lot more to do than either what the Jaguars have said they want to do to the stadium is going to cost a lot more than that. I think it's 68% of people, in total 80% of people opposed using public financing, 68% of Democrats and 68% of Republicans. It's shocking how much people
unify around this issue.
Right, but I spoke with sports economists, and they've said, the best way if the Jaguars really, really want to get people to support the idea of maybe thinking to spend a couple dollars, win.
Well, I mean, I think we see in New York right now, like the New York is paying $1 billion for the Buffalo Bills, and how much the outrage there is over that too. I mean, this is another issue
we probably don't want that in Jacksonville with the kind of.
No. Yeah, New York is spending. The Bills are spending $1.4 billion. $850 million of that is public money. I'll say this though. The Bills have a lot more fans than we do down here in Jacksonville. People can get mad at me for saying that, but I was at the Bills at Jaguars game last year, and that sounded like a Buffalo home game.
Plus, Kathy Holsell, the governor of New York, is from Buffalo, and Buffalo is New York's only professional football team.
Ooh,
there. Wow,
on that note, we're going to go to our final portion of this illustrious panel, our lightning round. That's right. So I'm going to go first for our lightning round. We're going to talk about the biggest topics of the week that we didn't get to cover on the show, but are of interest to us. For me, until September 11th, the Museum of Science and History, affectionately known locally as MOSH, is hosting an interesting exhibit from the Smithsonian Museum, The Bias Inside Us. It's a community engagement project featuring the science and history of bias and what people can do about it. It's there until September 11th. Go check it out. Will, your lightning round pick.
My lightning round pick, we do a lot of talking about the Title IX and 50th anniversary of Title IX, but, the women's soccer season kicks off right now. UNF has their women's soccer opener, kicks off at 10 a.m. They're playing Middle Tennessee State. Jacksonville University had their women's soccer opener yesterday. They tied Coastal Carolina 2-2. We always like to talk about supporting women's sports, and there's always this big discussion. So I'd love to see more people supporting women's sports in this town. So JU and UNF have volleyball teams and soccer teams that are kicking off their seasons events in the coming days. So go support them.
Andrew, let's hear yours.
Well, today is my oldest son's 7th birthday,
All
so I'm
right.
going to go ahead and say
Congratulations.
that my favorite news of the week is Calvin turning 7 years old.
Happy birthday,
Oh,
Calvin.
Happy birthday,
Happy
Calvin.
birthday, Calvin. Jack.
Wow, mine's very, very boring. As a lawyer, I was telling Andrew before, I do a lot of work with private equity groups and things of that nature. So I'm really interested to see what the governor has to say next week about his new ESG policy, environmental, social, and governmental guidelines for the restrictions the governor wants to place on Florida pension investments. It's going to be very interesting. It's very complex, complicated issues. So. Again, very boring, but interesting to me. Thank you very much.
You know, it was interesting to me, too. Don't worry about it, Jack. All right, Claire, let's hear yours to finish
All right,
off.
well, I'll cap it off with something nice, good news, local news. So a fundraiser that was launched by pop star Ariana Grande earlier this year has raised $3 million for LGBTQ youth, some of which is going to our local facility, Jasmine, and also some to Equality Florida.
All right, thank you very much to my panel, Will Brown, WJCT News, Andrew Pantazzi, the Tributary, Jack Webb, recovering politician.
I'm almost there.
From the Daily Dot. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Coming up this week on What's Health Got to Do with It, we'll examine the month's top medical headlines with our medical roundtable. And today at noon, the Florida Roundup is going to take a closer look at what are alleging new Florida laws around education are threatening students' First Amendment rights. Thanks to all of our roundtable participants. And up next, after this short break, we're going to celebrate 5 years of Babs Labs. We'll be right back.
On the next Science Friday, NASA is taking the first step to send people back to the moon. We've been there half a dozen times, so what's left to learn?
It's like having a library about the history of the universe right next door.
The quest begins with Artemis 1, scheduled to launch at the end of the month. We'll talk about it on Science Friday from WNYC Studios.
This afternoon at 3, here on WJCT News 89.9.
Joe Biden reaches for the presidential pen, not before taking a presidential pop.
Every single Republican in Congress voted against this bill.
Liz Cheney is out in Wyoming, and Dr. Oz regrets recent remarks he made out shopping.
That's $20 for crudité, and this doesn't include the tequila. That's outrageous.
That more on the Friday News Roundup next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Babs Labs, a space where the community can come together to witness artistic work that uplifts, breaks barriers, and crosses lines, is celebrating its 5th anniversary this weekend. I'm here with Babs.
But yes, a lot of people know me as Babs now.
And so you're the Lab's founder and artistic director. You're hitting a very big milestone, 5 years. Tell us a little bit about the offerings at Babs Labs.
Well, we're primarily focused on storytelling. And I've created monthly story slams where people can come and just get up on stage and share a story about a particular theme. I found that by doing this, it's encouraging people to share. It's a real listening room. We have a lot of fun. We have a lot of people telling stories that they've actually never told in their life. So it feels like a very safe space because it is. There's something about everybody being quiet, just listening to somebody's words and being witnessed. So it's scary, but once people get up, they're like, wow, that felt really good. So I'm all about empowering people through oral storytelling.
And so how did you get started? 5 years is a pretty long project. What did it look like when you were first getting this off the ground?
Well, it's actually started from a very young age, because when I was very young, I realized that singing, telling stories, got me attention because I was just good at it. And then I went to school in acting and all of that. So I came to Florida. I had my own like soirees in my home, encouraging people to get performers and everything. So it was always my dream to have my own space. I worked at Players by the Sea for 9 years as the education director, but I moved downtown, and that sort of changed energy and da 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 da. I ended up really being blessed that I could get a space at the Cork Arts District, where there's mostly visual artists. So I have a performing space, and it's basically my living room. It's my home. And I'm inviting people into it. So I train, and I want to elevate the conversation, having people be able to really express their feelings and their ideas in embodied storytelling. A lot about gesture and movement. That's where the training is focused.
And so are these just artists that you're bringing in, or is it everyone from the community?
Anybody. In fact, it's interesting, but it's not actors coming. It's not performers. It's anybody. Anybody is showing up, and they will sit there and they'll say, "Oh, no, I'm not telling a story. I'm here to listen." And I'll be okay. And then all of a sudden, that like I see them raising their hand. They want to put their hand, that their name in the hat. And they'll tell me later, just was so inspired. I realized I was sitting there with this great story, and it seemed like, hey, it'll be fun to tell it.
And so you offer improvisation classes, communication workshops, monthly story slams, which is what we're discussing now,
Right.
and also one-on-one coaching. What does that look like?
Yeah, so I work with people who just want to be better public speakers. There are writers who want to be better at presenting and get out of their reading voice and be in the now voice. I help people develop. I'm a narrative coach. I help people develop their stories. And in fact, I'm the artistic director of a series at the Florida Theater started called Untold Stories. So that's a lot of training with 6 storytellers, a curated evening of storytelling.
And they're going to have their second season of that Untold Stories, and
Yeah.
you're also going to be involved in that.
Yes, they asked me back, and I'm thrilled. And we had a very successful first season. So I think the first show is November 3rd.
November 3rd, get your tickets today.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, tonight is going to be a celebration, and I'll be announcing my class schedule. We're planning a lot of workshops. I collaborate with a lot of organizations and other artists, and I incorporate art a lot into my space. So tonight, Tiffany Manning her work will be up because the theme is blowout, and she has the most energized, glorious paintings. So
And
I
if
asked her.
for our listeners who want to take part in that, that's going to be tonight. Doors open at 7:15. It starts at 8, and tickets are only $16. So make sure you go to barbaracolaccello.com/register and get involved. You talked a little bit about, it's not just for artists. You bring in everybody from the community, anyone who wants to
Absolutely.
walk in. I thought this was pretty interesting. So I kind of read this tidbit that you began your career working with Andy Warhol, actually, and that's kind of
Yeah.
his whole medium is accessible art, pop culture art for
Yeah,
everyone.
yeah, and I mean, Andy. I was working at the Yves Saint Laurent boutique when I first got out of college, and Andy would come in and have me help him, and he would constantly say, "Gee, you're working so hard for Eve. You could be working hard for me," and he acted like I had this direct relationship with Yves Saint Laurent, but yeah. I had an arts background, but I ended up on the business side as the advertising director. But learning how to sell Andy, especially at that time where agencies would look at me like, we're not going to invest in a Warhol magazine like this rag. I had to find creative ways to encourage them. And that's what basically I'm doing at Babs Lab. I am encouraging people to get creative. You can be creative, to trust your intuition. Big part of improvisation.
Right. Well, I'd really like to thank you for coming in.
Yes, thank you.
Babs Labs, it's going to have that show tonight. Again, doors open 7:15. The show starts at 8. Don't miss it. You can learn all about our local arts community. If you're not an artist, you've heard it right here. You can still get involved. Maybe you will become an artist afterwards. Maybe there's an artist
A
hiding inside of all of
storyteller.
us.
I always say we all carry stories.
Oh, I like that one. That's one I'm gonna. I feel like that applies to journalists too. Anyone can be a journalist too. We're all citizen journalists. Everyone has a story.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes. Bye.
That was our show today. David Luckin is our executive producer. Our senior producer is Heather Schatz. Catherine Hobbs is our associate producer. Our director is Josh Torres. Jessica Palumbo is our editorial director. Our news editor is Randy Roguski. If you have any questions or comments about First Coast Connect, you can send us an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. I'm Ray Troncoso. I'm sitting in for Melissa Ross, and you're listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville, and we'll be back on Monday.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan